Hi everyone. Well, it is a snow day here in New York. Yeah, it's been snowing and it's just really cold now, so I'm inside today and I thought I'd paint for you. This subject I'm going to do is from a photo I took yesterday when it was really snowing. So this is a view of the sailboat pond frozen over in Central Park here in New York. And believe it or not, this is a full color photograph. But of course, the colors in winter tend to be a little more subdued and subtle than normal. But in a snowstorm, obviously, they're even more muted. For those of you who follow me at all, you know I am, well, I wouldn't say I'm anti-reference photo, but I'm always warning painters about the downsides of copying for sure, but in relying too heavily on reference photos because typically they tend to unify the values and make the background look as dominant as the foreground, etc. But because of the weather conditions, this reference photo has a really clear sense of foreground, background, midground, and a really pretty simple but solid value construction. I didn't even really have to do a value study, but I did just to make it easier to talk about and to explain. So even in the best of conditions, things that are in the foreground tend to look a little more in focus, a little more crisp. Doesn't mean you have to paint them that way, but if you want something to look very obviously in the foreground, that's something you can think about. Conversely, those things in the background tend to look a little desaturated, lighter, and edges in watercolor are one of its superpowers. So things in the distance can tend to look a little fuzzier, a little more out of focus, a little more reliance on soft edges, and then midground elements are somewhere in the middle. Almost all my paintings I arrange with three basic values: lights, midtones, darks, and I think about three spatial relationships: foreground, midground, background. Obviously, a painting on canvas or paper is it's all two dimensions. We have only width and height to play with. So anything we can do to imply three-dimensionality or perspective is at least something to think about. I am personally obsessed with different ways of creating that illusion of three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional surface. But like I was saying a moment ago, because of the storm, the weather conditions, this illusion of foreground, midground, background is pretty obvious even in this reference photo. And the three basic values: light in the midground, primarily on the roof of the old boathouse, a little bit of light in the sky, and a little bit of light on the frozen lake. So light, 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 and then mid-tone in the background, light in the midground, dark in the foreground. And that's what I've tried to indicate here. The tree will be the darkest. The trees and little outlines of the buildings along Fifth Avenue or in the background will be mid-toned. And the only light, it's very little, but it's important, will be the snow-covered roof of the boathouse, a little bit of gleam of light on the frozen lake, and then secondarily, a little bit of light up here in the sky. I want the dominant light here. It's never really a good idea to have too much of your darkest darks or lightest lights on the edges of your composition. They'll tend to pull the eye out. But I want light here, although not necessarily pure white. I'll probably save anything that's completely unpainted, pure white paper for this area. Anyway, very simple value scheme. Here is the drawing I just sketched up. Really pretty simple. I want it to be simple. I'm always saying I try my best. Sometimes it works better than others, but my goal as a painter is to paint my experiences of a place, not just the particulars of what a thing looks like when you are standing there looking at it, but what it feels like. What's the emotional experience? What's your interpretation of what you look at? I don't really need to do a lot of interpretation here. I think the drama of A Winter's Day comes across pretty well in the reference. So, the dominant technical approach that I'm going to be talking about here and demonstrating, I hope, is edges. A reliance on soft edges rather than harder edges. Harder edges would make probably more sense if it were a bright, sunny, crisp day. But a bit softer makes more sense for the mood I'm trying to paint and for the actuality of that day. So I'm starting off with clear water and then doing a pretty large graded wash. I'm going to begin it with this Holbein lavender color. So it's not a bright purple, but it's just a soft lavender. I could even make an argument for doing this whole painting in one color, or no color really, just monotone. But I want to imply some really soft, subtle winter colors. So I'm grading the lavender down into a cobalt teal. For this kind of graded wash to work, you have to use a pretty good amount of water in your brush. And just what you're really doing is pulling this bead of water down the page. So the only thing I have to think about here is saving light where I want it, which will be primarily on the roof of the boathouse by the pond. So yeah, I have a little light saved up in the sky. I've tried to tone it with a little lavender, but it may actually be a little too much light way up there. I want it light, but I don't necessarily want it white. I'm painting on a fairly angled surface, about 40 degrees from flat, because I want to allow gravity to work for me to pull these different tones together as they move down the page. So this is Holbein Mineral Violet and a little bit of neutral tint mixed in. In here I'm being just a little careful, just so that I can save the light, the snow on top of the boathouse. I want this whole wash to get subtly but decidedly darker as it comes down the page. And I don't want a lot of detail in here, but I do want to suggest it. So I'm going to be dropping in some other tones. This is a lunar violet, which is very granulating. It's not a color I use very often, but I think the granulation may help me to get where I want to go to tell the story I'm trying to tell in a more effective way. For a couple of days there was almost no traffic outside, but the roads are pretty clear and the sidewalks are open again. So you can hear the lovely traffic sounds. Just sort of, I don't want to say carelessly, but impressionistically dropping in additional tones to add additional texture into this little violet wash in the back, just to add some textural variety. Now, as it gets down, this wash reaches down into the composition to the edge where the pond starts. There are little bits of white preserved on the walkway and here and there. So I don't want to be too picky about that or too specific. So I'm going to take a 1/2 inch flat brush and then just try to dry brush in some effects like that. So you'll get some sparkles. I'm using the edge of the flat brush to, I really want to imply any kind of detail. So any architectural detail that's too specific is a mistake. I want everything to be purposefully just a little out of focus. Some of these big, old, famous residential buildings are sticking up above the winter trees in the background. I do want that effect, but I don't want it to be quite as crisp or legible as I'm painting it. So I'm just going to try to rough in the shapes quickly. Then I will hit them with my, sorry, I'm trying to manipulate the amount of slope here because I don't want this bead to run down. But here along the edge, I'm going to just hit it with my mist bottle to keep the silhouettes of those buildings, but soften them so they're less specific and softer edges. Here I'm tipping the board up and side to side to try to encourage all those tones to run together. And here's some intentional backwash even. And over on this side, I want to do something similar to what I did over there. So these big wet washes they have some advantage, but some disadvantage too, in that you build up these big beads, and if you're not careful, they could run down, and wouldn't be the end of the world if they did, but I don't want that to happen. So with my left hand, I'm holding the board up to try to control the amount of slope, the amount of gravity and the speed with which these washes run together. So now I'm going to turn it upside down and allow that darker bead at the bottom to run up into the wetter zones. This will prevent it from running down over the water that I want to preserve as light, but also helps darken some of this wash here. Yeah, everything's okay. It's not quite where I want it, so it's still quite wet, so I have some time to manipulate it. Sprayed my buildings in the background, which was the thing to do, but they almost vanished completely. So before they dry anymore, just add a hint of detail without any real detail. Just a sense of identity. The main thing I know from my observations, but also in doing the reference, is the value I want this to be. Lighter, light of course, light here, but all of this area has to be neither too light nor too dark, so really mid-toned. Doing those value studies, even for a simple value composition like this, can be really helpful. They just make it almost impossible to forget what needs to stay light and what has to go dark. It's a very wet wash, so I'm just tilting the board around to try to connect all those different value shapes together. So I like this hint of the skyline behind. I think this area needs more, bit more texture, more value. As it begins to dry, you can still drop in tones wet and wet. And here, this is just a pretty much neutral tint. With this mid-size mop brush, I'm just dropping in color, or not color, value, but saving some little lighter bits as if texture in some of the out of focus trees in the background there. And I also want to subtly set up within this band a bit of layering. So this band, this lower band of the middle section will be a little darker and the background will be a little lighter. Subtle, but that too will help emphasize this sense of three-dimensionality. Here, I just pull some fluid out of the brush, and then I'm using the drier end of the brush to siphon up some of those really wet bits before they run down. You could just touch that area with the corner of a paper towel too. Yeah, there we go. So this kind of thing I like. I'm wondering if I could put a little bit of a sepia, modify it with some brown. I don't want it to jump off the page, but just a little bit of warmer tone dropped into that darker cool. Maybe, but I think a little of that is plenty. I really want this overall painting to have a subtle range of colors, but really almost read as a monotone. Yeah, I think that's going to be good. It's quite wet what I'm dropping it into, so it will settle out and join together a little bit. I'm painting it like this so that I get a sort of purposefully irregular edge. Some nice variety. And if I'm concentrating on any of this at all, or one area of any of this, it's right around the roof of the boathouse, a bit more than the areas radiating out from that, so that I can bump up the contrast here a little bit subtly. So there, I just was using the side of this mid-size mop brush to just sort of scrub in some value. I think the general value looks about right, but I'm not too happy with that harder edge. So again, out comes the mist bottle, and that'll soften up that area and just get those tones to run together in a more organic, subtle way. Over here, I'll drop in a bit more of the browns. So you can see I'm going for sort of a warm, cool toggle, but in a very contained, not controlled, but narrower range. Obviously, before I'm done, the tree limbs coming down will be about the last thing I'll paint. They'll be quite dark. But secondarily, there's some smaller trees I think I probably want to indicate both on this and that side in a darker value, but not as dark as what's going on up top. I really am trying to get the feel that you're standing in a snowstorm. So things look a bit blurry, a little bit out of focus, a little bit hard to identify. This is such a wet wash. Now, you'll probably remember from the reference photo and also from my compositional study that the roof of this little building is white because of the snow, but the face of it is not. And in point of fact, it's brick, so red, but it's such a hazy, snowy day that it's not going to read as bright red, so I want sort of a dusky, subdued, more subtle, warm tone. Not to be accurate, but I just think there's going to be so much cool in this building, in this painting, that a little contrast here of darker, warm tones will look good if I don't make it too bright. Just see some of these deeper saturated reds reading through. Very little clarity on what is doors or windows or anything like that. So I want to imply some detail without painting too much of it at all. I'm using the side of this flat brush to try to finish out the extremities. I like this general look, but I'm just concerned that there's a little too much busyness over there. But I think it'll be fine. I can always get rid of light, but it's hard to reintroduce it. So for this is a alizarin crimson that I'm going to use for the face of the building. But again, I don't want it too dark, so I'll dull it down even in my palette with a little neutral tint. So it's just sort of a warmish, grayish tone on purpose. Then I'm using this flat brush. I think the way to do it is just to sort of dry brush this tone across so that it has a few sparkles of light, but again, I want it to melt into the background. So I want to do this before all of this dries. So again, this sort of melts into the surrounding tones and doesn't look too plastered on, but it looks quite connected. That's my goal. So I'm encouraging some of these violet grayer tones to bleed into the face so that it toggles from the background, the forest, if you will, into the building, but there's not a hard line there. I do not want a hard line. I want this thing to appear, but to more subtly appear. This is not a building portrait. The little building is an important part of the overall composition, but it is just one part. So this kind of thing where the violet bleeds in and into that deep red is exactly the vibe I'm going for. Yeah, I really quite like that, and I'll even encourage a bit more of that, especially on this side, just with the flat end of a flat brush, and work a little bit more of that violet in to suggest some shadows. And to imply the front door just with some deeper tonalities there. The last thing I want to do is to get too detailed or specific about rendering or being too explicit. Yeah, that's pretty good. It's just an idea, slightly warmer than the background, but dark, not too dark, but part of that mid-tone, from a light mid-tone to a darker mid-tone. Now there's this bulkhead wall against the frozen lake that I think needs to be not overly crisp, but a little bit crisper. It's forward and it's sort of the datum line of the painting. So I'm going to take an 1/8 inch flat brush and use a little bit of this tone. It's not about color, it's more about value, but I'll take a bit of this violet neutral tint mix with a little bit of the Van Dyke brown in it and try to establish this bulkhead, this perimeter of the frozen pond. I don't mind that there's some light sparkles in it. I think that looks good. I want to leave this little thread of light on top because there was a band of snow and that looked good to me. I started in the middle, but this is pretty wet, so I'll be able to connect up to it to hopefully in one brush stroke flesh out the rest of this wall. And because this is the focal point of the painting, this I wanted a little more dark and a little more solid to keep it around that. If it gets a little feathery as it extends out, I think that's fine. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Now, I do want to save some light here in the pond, but I don't want the whole thing white. So I want to tone the bottom of the water light, but a little bit, I want to work some of this teal in. So I'll do that. Yeah, you can see now where this mid-tone, as the paint settles into the fibers and the water continues to run down within the fibers of the painting, you get some of these effects, which I think are beautiful. You can hope for them, but you can't really plan them. But that general vibe, I think, looks quite nice. I think you can tell that those are supposed to be trees, but obviously they're not in focus and they're obscured a bit by weather and they're in the distance. So to do the foreground, I'll go back to this mid-sized number 4 mop brush. I'll start off with some pure water. I think even over here on the left side, I'm going to bump it into the bulkhead wall so that melts a little bit and looks a little less crisp over there. I wanted the sides of the painting to dissolve a little bit more. Any clarity at all, it should be here. So I'll just bring that across, just plain water. Then a little bit of this teal, not too dark, and then some violet to finish it off. Violet mixed with neutral tint. And I didn't plan that little dry brush mark, but I like it. I think it's appropriate. Looks good, but I think a little more teal in the middle would help. And just a little bit stronger anchor violet at the bottom. It's okay, simpler is better. Yeah, simplicity is one of the, it sounds easy, it can be easy, but it's really to paint something with just one brush stroke, or to not do glazes, or simplicity, minimalism is something I'm often aiming for, but it can be the hardest thing to make look good because you have one shot. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, oh well. Now, within this bulk of the building, there is a front door and there are windows. I think it does need a little bit more identity, but I just don't want to approach the idea of detail. I just think it needs a little more presence and solidity. So I'm gonna try this and hope for the best. Taking a smaller flat brush, one of these Escoda perlas, and I'm gonna try to just dry brush with some of this neutral tint. This wall isn't perfectly dry yet, and that's kind of good because it'll here and there it'll melt some of what I'm doing, and it'll join up to the sides and look a little intentionally fuzzy, and I want that. Yeah, this is okay, but a little of this goes a long way, so I'm just going to use my finger to feather some of that tone out and keep it as obscure as I can, to be honest. Obviously, I can paint in a very detailed way. I think it would just be completely the wrong thing to do for this painting. What's so fun and satisfying when it works about painting things in weather like this, or sometimes evening or night views, is playing around with that human experience of not being able to see things entirely clearly if they're through failing light or weather conditions or any such thing, or if they're far away. So playing around with visibility is such a fun and satisfying little trick you can play with watercolor. I love it. Obviously this needs to be light. I'm going to leave the left side of this roof completely white and paint the right side just a very pale teal. Just a little something to make it turn the corner. So this is a cobalt teal and a fairly good amount of water. And I'm using this small flat brush again. So if it dissolves into some dry brush marks, that's fine. Just a little subtle tonal shift there. Now it has this beautiful little copper steeple up top. I want it there, but I don't want it to be as crisp and obvious as it is. It will have some banding and some snow will collect there, so I'll leave little glimmers of light up top, but I'm going to take some perylene green that I happen to just have sitting in my palette, mix it with a little bit of this lunar violet. Again, the small flat brush, and really hope for some of these scratchy dry brush marks, because I just don't want it to look too crisp or clear. Yeah, that's okay. I think that's enough, he says as he goes back. All right, back off. Now, the very top of the steeple is such a beautiful thing, but I want it to dissolve a little bit into the background to not be too busy. I can leave a little bit of white on it. I'm sure that I will. So we'll see. Whatever I do, I think less is more. I think I'll save this side, as it's upside down, the right side of it, a little bit more light, a as if there's some snow accumulated, and then as it rises up, just go into just a very lightest hint of detail. Not too bad. These look a little contrasty, but I think it's good because I'm going to put in a tree or two over here and here as well, but in about that a similar value pattern. So I think it's good. I'm just trying to keep myself from over detailing this thing. The fact that it's out of focus is kind of the point. So a little bit of clarity is a good thing, but too much, it'll very quickly start to look like a technical rendering or architectural drawing, and I just don't want that. No, I don't. Okay. Background's still quite wet. I could see, well, I could lie and say I'm very happy with that background altogether. I'm not unhappy with it, but I think it needs a little bit more value, maybe 5% more. So I'd rather not do it, but I think I should glaze over the top of the painting again. And that way, everybody that's watching can shake their heads and say, I knew it. I knew it wasn't dark enough. That guy blew it. That's okay. What I'm doing now is adding just a little bit of this thinking to the very base of the building. So just little bits of value to help center the composition here, to anchor the building a little. But what I'm trying not to do is anything too technical or specific. Just add value where it's needed, but not detail where it isn't. Okay, I think this is not dry, it's still a little buckled, but I'm going to add some idea of these somewhat darker trees left and right. I think the key here is really the same as it's been throughout. This is not getting too dark, but also not getting too specific. These overhanging limbs are going to be very specific, and that's part of what's going to establish this idea of the foreground. So the key for these midground trees is a little bit more focal than obviously these buildings or these mid-band trees, but the only tricky thing in this painting is kind of staging the clarity or the amount of visibility, if you will, from higher in the foreground, less in this band, and almost none behind. So knowing that I have to do that makes it easier, but it would be really easy to overdo it. What I'm using here is this really, really tiny flat brush that I got from a friend. It's just this tiniest little flat brush, and it's sometimes a very handy thing. So I can, I'm not using much water, and it's almost dry brushing some ideas of limbs and trunks. So the dry brush helps because if the brush marks break up and leave a little air in between them, it doesn't look as solid or as technical. It looks more impressionistic, and that is what I'm after. Quicker I can make these marks for the most part, the better they're going to look, I believe. And again, I want this tree to be there, but not too in your face, so I'm trying to modify the amount of saturation and the amount of visibility. So here, I'm not trying to be accurate to the photo. I'm trying to just look at the painting and decide what is needed as opposed to what I think I should paint, but paint only that which is needed to help the composition as a whole. For these somewhat smaller trees that are behind it, I'm using watered down Van Dyke brown. I'm just dry brushing in some marks just to add some general texture. I'm not 100% certain if this is a good thing to do, but I'm going to take this Escoda liner brush and some of this Van Dyke brown that I dropped into the wet wash in the back and add some textural idea of dried leaves and twigs on these winter trees. Why I'm not sure if it's the right thing to do is because this can quickly become too specific and too illustrative, too detailed, too quickly. I'll soften it out with a little raw umber, just a very light, warm wash. Yeah, I think it's all right. I'm going to just mist this lightly here to kind of knock back some of those edges. I think the tone is good, but I don't think all those edges are needed. And then with a paper towel, I'll go in and just further soften up some of those areas. Now what I'm going to do is take my 1/2-inch flat that I've been using and under the tree add some additional tone in kind of a dry brush way, so I'll leave some sparkles of light melted into the building again. What I'm hoping to do here is just sort of, again, further melt that tree into the background, but also add some additional texture and value at the bottom of that shape to help pull all of this down to the ground. Yeah, I think that's good. So you can see the tree, it's there, but it isn't too dominant. What really is more visible over here is not object or thing, but this transitional value from light to a darker mid-tone. Before that dries entirely, I'll just drop in little bits of this raw umber to hopefully successfully create this kind of a haze of wintry trees behind. Yeah, okay, I think that's enough. We get it. Good. I want to do something similar over here, but probably a little softer. I'm sort of coming 1/3 of the way into the composition, and this is sort of the dominant axis. This is the secondary. So anything over here wants to be, I think, a little softer. But this should take a little less time because that side was a bit of an experiment, and I'll just try to mimic some of what I did over there stylistically over here. This is small Escoda flat, and I'm just dry brushing in some verticals to imply some tree shapes without getting too specific about it. Then back to this liner brush that I often use for trees. I think over here I will just use the raw umber, which is the softer, warm tone. Very little water. I'm just using the side of it to make this textural shape that I hope will read like midground trees. Again, with trying really hard not to get too specific or picky about actual identities, but just think about shapes. Watercolor, gosh, it's really all about shapes. So generally I'm happy with this. I don't hate this, but again, I want to anchor it down. So I'll take my flat brush again, some of this unky soup of mineral violet and neutral tint, and for the most part paint up from the bottom to try to anchor this shape, connect the trees to the foreground, to the building. Yeah, okay. The big thing left to do, of course, at this stage is now to start to plan out the darkest darks, the trees. But I have to be happy enough with this whole mid-band before I do that. And if I'm really honest, I'm not 100% happy with it. So I'm gonna glaze over the midground and the sky to add just a little bit more depth. But ideally, this should have been correct with my first wash. Not the end of the world that it wasn't, but what I have to do is figure out the best way to do this. Simpler is almost always better, so I'm just gonna mist this area down to the top of those trees. This is just clear water, of course. Go back to my mid-size mop brush. This is the violet. It's got a little bit of neutral tint mixed in. I'm mixing a little bit more mineral violet, so it's just subtly a little bit more purple. Overall, there's not a lot of downside in doing this. It might soften up some of these trees, but that's probably a good thing. But it may obscure some of the tops of those buildings I had, which isn't such a terrible thing. If I really need to, I can go back and reestablish them. Into the top of that wash, I'm adding a little bit more neutral tint. Cobalt teal. Then, just up through the mid-ground, and yes, much better. Back to clear water. easier in these cases just to mist it and let it sort of paint itself. So these buildings in the background didn't actually melt away completely, which is a good thing. Why I did that was I just felt this midground, mid-tone, such a compositionally important element. It just looked a little too weak. I did not want to kill the light up here, and I don't think I did, but I did soften it a bit. But as I said at the outset, the light obviously here is more important, secondarily here, and it reads to me much more like that now. I should be able to turn this over without much hazard. When you do that, the top of the wash will wash back into the lower portions, but since it's so light at the top, I don't think that's going to be a big problem. If I'm honest, I also think this looks good, but it's a little too bright. A little brightness here is good, but while I'm at it, I'm going to tone this before I start in on the super darks. So a little bit more of this cobalt teal here to soften this, and then I'm going to dry brush it over to leave some sparkles on that side. Same thing, a little more violet at the bottom. So again, I didn't kill the light at all, but I did soften it, so it really helps focus here. I would normally just let this air dry, but to speed this process up for you, I'm going to just hair dry it so I can get started on the darks quickly. So it's pretty dry. It's not 100% dry, but that's okay. It's dry enough that it will hold an edge. As the fibers continue to dry inside the paper, it will flatten out completely. I should also mention I'm working on Arches paper today, rough surface, 140 pound at a quarter sheet size, so it's about 11 by 15 inches. Nice size to paint, a little small, but it fits on camera nicely and you can see what I'm doing. Okay, now for the darkest darks, I want to use a little less water, a little more pigment in general. So I want them to be dark. The value is more important than the color. But I think I'm going to modify this violet neutral tint wash over here and warm it up a little with a little bit of, this is sepia. So it'll be a pretty neutral color, but I want to add a little bit of warmth to it. But again, the color's pretty much insignificant. It's the value that really matters. The color would matter more if any of these shapes were quite large and took up more space, but they don't. So again, the value is critical. I'll get it in a few minutes. Sorry everyone, I had a delivery I had to answer. But all is well. So I'm using this pretty inexpensive 1/8 inch flat brush. Why I say it's inexpensive? Because it's synthetic, which means it really doesn't hold a lot of water. And in certain cases like this, that's a good thing. Because it doesn't hold a lot of water, you can get these dry brush marks more easily. Part of this tree, I want it to be pretty solidly dark. But as it goes off the page, especially up at the top, I want to soften that harder edge. And make it filter out a little. So I'll be using a number of different brushes, but for the slightly larger bits of these limbs, I'll be using flat brushes. You can just get marks like that more easily where they aren't just solid as if they're painted by ink, but they have a little bit of that dry brush character that I like. It's one of the great things about watercolor. You can toggle in and out of clarity and suggestiveness by the kind of brushworks you choose to use. So even dry brush, if you go quite slow and push your brush down into the fibers more, it'll make a hard, solid line. But if you paint quite quickly and don't apply much pressure, you can get these beautiful dry brush marks that have some aeration to them. And I mean, it depends on the painting, but it's often sort of the contrast or the combination of the two that's appealing. There's so much character in these dark branches. I love painting these. I'm not really looking at the reference. I did sketch on some of the major shapes earlier. I'm following what's actually there a little bit, but not that much. I'm just sort of designing it as I go to hopefully look as more appropriate to the specific painting. Not much is done on the dark branches, but already you can see, because they're dark in value and because they have, generally speaking, crisper edges, they feel forward. They feel much more forward of the background, certainly, but they feel more forward than this. So even at this state, you're getting a clear sense of foreground, midground, background. And is that always what you should be going for in your paintings? That's not for me to say. I can say for me, it is one of the main things I'm almost always shooting for. Of course, it depends on the subject and whatever it is you're trying to portray, but it's just one of those things that I find endlessly fun to play with and to try to suggest. I have always been just addicted to the idea of perspective. Linear perspective, yes, you know, vanishing points and all that, but the perspective you can get by layering, the layering of values is just gorgeous. So I want a few of these smaller branches at least to physically lap over the boathouse just for some additional contrast to further emphasize that sense of foreground, midground, background. But I don't want to obscure it too much, but I think a little bit of it will be a good thing, pleasant to look at. I'm even going to bring a few branches, though this doesn't really happen, but right down over the water too. I think a little of this will be a good thing. It just will graphically connect all planes of the painting and all elements. So the ultimate look I'm going for is sort of a scrim that you're looking through to see the scene beyond. Check the record clock. I don't know that I'm going to be able to do this entire tree. There's a lot and it's a little bit slow going, and I think I'm almost at about an hour record time, so I'm trying to keep these videos maxed at about an hour. If I don't, they become a little tedious. The upload time takes forever and the quality can be affected, so I'll try to get some of the major identifying elements of the tree in, and then so you'll get the idea, and then I'll do the rest off camera. It was such a beautiful day. It was actually freezing, but I really love snow. I like Central Park in the snow is just phenomenal. I know, I'm spoiled. I don't have to shovel it and I don't have to drive in it, but I've done plenty of time doing both of those things, so it's nice at this point in my life I don't have to. Lucky me. But just trying to walk through it was... We don't get that much snow in New York typically, and certainly not in the park. Usually it doesn't snow until February or so, and even at that, not very much. So this year we've had quite a few really beautiful snowstorms here in the city. But again, beautiful snowstorm is not what everybody would call it, I get it. So I'm lucky I don't have to deal with it. So here and there I may refer to the reference photo, but so far I'm not. I'm just trying to establish, I hope, an attractive pattern, almost an abstract pattern of these limbs. I know there's some much smaller elements that I'm going to have to figure out how to deal with, little twigs and old seed pods or something left hanging on the tree that I can ignore all that, but I just think the texture of the tree as it was in the photograph is quite beautiful. Let's take a look. Yeah, so obviously the main structure of the tree is not that hard, but these smaller twigs and then some of these little pods left hanging on the dormant branches, I think will be pretty critical. Not because they're there in the photo, but I just think they'll make the painting much nicer, just the contrast of textures. As the tree begins to get smaller, these branches I've swapped out to a very small mop brush, very sharp, small point to try to gradate the size of these branches down. Normally, I think, for the most part, I'd be a little bit more impressionistic about the specifics of trees and their branches and all of that, but I think in this painting, everything is so hinted at and out of focus and suggested that the tree really needs to be probably the most important, or I don't like the word detail, but the most in focus component of the overall composition. So the tree is a very critical part of whether or not this will be a good painting or not. And it really is right up front and in your face. So I'm intentionally being much more specific and careful about it. That doesn't mean there won't be elements of it that I'll paint like this, more suggestively. As I begin to add more texture, I can see doing a lot of this. But for the big structural shapes, I have to be a little bit more specific, I think. So I am going to call it as far as recording. I'll show you what I have in mind for these textural pods and things. I'm going to try to do some splattering. Same color, this dark neutral tint with a little bit of sepia in it. And I'll just splatter some of this darker tones on like this. Right on top of everything. You can go too far with this, I get it, but again, I think for this composition, that kind of specificity is a good thing. Yeah, overall I'm very happy with this painting so far. Again, I need to spend, I'm going to guess it's going to take almost another hour or so to flesh out all the tiny little twigs. I think that would be a lot to expect anybody to watch. So I just am going to thank you for your time and your attention. And yeah, I'll finish this painting up off camera, and I'll post it all over my socials. I'll use it as a thumbnail for the YouTube video, but I think you get the gist of where I'm going. Hope it was entertaining and helpful if you're painting. So thanks so much, and I'll see you all soon. Happy painting.